Hey, what's up, Canada and beyond? I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to finally get a chance to sit down and talk to our guest tonight and maybe give Canada a little bit more of the credit that it is due. But at the end of the day, to the point of today's exercise is to absolutely dispel a boatload of this dumpster fire that the MSM has been lying to y'all about. So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, grannies, gators, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Give this a share. You're not going to find this on your typical social media platforms. That's why we are streaming this live to whatsupcanada.org, lgm.news, and Twitter. So, without further ado, I am going to bring on the guest I've been waiting a long time for, Scott. Welcome to What's Up Canada, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here.
Well, the privilege and the honor is all mine. So, for folks that aren't familiar, I am. I've been following your work since Iraq and all of that dumpster fire that you brought to light for most of the rest of the world. And since then, you have carried on consistently, despite everything that the opposition does, because they do what they do. They don't know what else to do. But you've been totally on point with everything that's been going on in the geopolitical situation. And one of the things that I do notice, and like I said, in my intro, is Canada does not get enough credit for some of the what they contribute to this dumpster fire. I know that they are really, in the grand scheme of things, nothing more than Chihuahua government in the grand scheme of things, but through their history with a lot of this stuff that's been going on, Canada's helps plant a lot of the foundations in Ukraine about what's going on, and people don't know exactly how that all works. I'm not sure you do even, but I'm sure that you know that Canada's been next to Ukraine, one of the most corrupt governing bodies on the planet for a long time, and is kind of the Maytag money laundering machine for the dark side of the world. How far am I off on any of my assessment there so far, Scott?
Well, like you said, I can't claim to be an expert on the intricacies of Canadian domestic politics and such. What I can say is in relation to Ukraine, um, Canada is home to a very large and very active Ukrainian diaspora, and it's a diaspora that has been hijacked by Western Ukrainian nationalists who have an affinity for the odious ideology of Stepan Bandera, who is, close ties with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, whose forces participated in the slaughter and butcher of tens of thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians, hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians. Truly one of the most hate-filled characters, and yet in diaspora, this movement has, reimagined itself. It's gone away from being collaborators with Hitler and the Nazis of the worst kind, by the way, the worst kind. The crimes perpetrated by the Ukrainian nationalists loyal to Stepan Bandera are beyond imagination. And yet they've been reimagined as, freedom fighters, people who, they fought both Nazi Germany and they fought Joseph Stalin's Soviet horde. These are the bravest of the brave, the purest of the pure, the most noble people in the world. Stepan Bandera is a misunderstood character. He really just stands for a united, independent, free Ukraine, free like Canada is free like America's is free. No, he stands for mass murder. He stands for white racist ideology. He stands for Nazi ideology. But it's been mainstreamed in Canada. I mean, these Western Ukrainians have been coddled by Canada. And it's not just, when I say Western Ukrainians, understand this. To give you an example, the Waffen SS, sort of the elite murderous arm of the Nazi ideology, they had a division, the 14th Galatian Division, Galatia being the term for that area in Central and Eastern Europe where Western Ukrainian is located. They fought alongside the Nazis for the duration of the conflict. When the war ended, um, they turned themselves over to the Allies. And instead of being repatriated to the Soviets, where they would have received their just rewards, um, they were sent on diaspora, and many of them went to Canada. So Canada became the receiving uh, nation for thousands of SS stormtroopers. But they reimagined themselves. They weren't SS stormtroopers. They were fighting the Soviets. They were freedom fighters. Um, and next thing you know, these people become mainstreamed into Canada's academic, political, economic circles. To give you, maybe the most prominent example is Chrystia Freeland. Um,
We
she,
know a lot about Chrystia
all right,
Freeland.
well,
Glad to
Chrystia,
hear you bring her up.
one of the things about this organization, Ukrainian nationalists that exist, um, they claim that they're just promoting Ukrainian cultural values, and they have something called, I think it's the plank movement. It's a scouting movement. It's Boy Scouts, it's Girl Scouts, it's fuzzy, it's friendly, they're wonderful. No, these are it's a movement designed to indoctrinate the youth. They bring them in and they are taught the history of Western Ukraine, the culture, the glory of Stepan Bandir, the glory of the heroes, Slava Ukraina, you know, and people need to understand when they hear that Slava Ukraina, it doesn't mean glory to Ukraine. Just like Sig Heil doesn't mean, salute you. Sig Heil means I am a Nazi. And
Mhm.
Slava Ukraina means I am a Banderist. It is the war cry of the Bandera movement, shouted out as they shoved women, children, the elderly into barns, into churches, and set them on fire, burning hundreds to death at a time. Slava Ukraina, that's what it means. And they're taught this from the earliest age. Chrystia Freeland is a byproduct of this scouting movement. She is a hardcore Nazi through and through. She is a true believer. And then she became a senior Canadian official. Just like in the United States, we have people like Victoria Nuland and others who replicate this hateful ideology. Um, and here they are making decisions. They're polluting the minds of the Canadian population. They're using their influence in Canadian mainstream media to ignore the reality of the past, to continue this glorification. And it led to Canadian troops being sent to Ukraine as part of a NATO training mission where they trained the Azov Regiment. These are literal Nazis. These are the worst of the worst. And there's Canada training guys that have swastikas and other Nazi symbology on their uniform. And Chrystia Freeland is okay with that because that's who she is. She went on a parade, and it's not just the Ukrainian flag. She was given the Azov banner. The Ukrainian flag, of course, is blue over gold, the blue sky, the gold, the grain fields. The Azov, the Bander's banner, is blood red over black soil, blood and soil. That's their symbol. That's their ideology. She's okay with that. She's okay with parading with this. She's an odious individual, a hateful individual, and she's a large reason why Canada today is positioned on the wrong side of history when it comes to Ukraine and this conflict with Russia.
It's it's not often I bring guests on because I want them to corroborate things that I've been screaming from the mountaintops, but there's a couple of points in what we're going to talk about here tonight where that's going to happen, and I'm grateful and glad for it. And that's particularly one of them. And you brought up the fact that Canadian troops have been over there training these guys for a long time.
Yeah,
And in Canada, there were some feeble attempts to bring this to the public's attention going up to 2018, 2019. Even the National Post was trying to explain to Canadians that, look, your government is sending a lot of money over there and training these guys. Now this seems to be a continuously devolving situation, and they're all complicit in covering it up. But one of the other sides of this that I think is speaks to the motive of why this that there's never going to be an off ramp as long as Biden isn't in power, and we have this regime led basically by Chrystia Freeland, who is Klaus Schwab's hand, and also George Soros's right hand at the same time. So you're right. She is absolutely an odious person that has got herself in the swing positions of what's manifesting itself across the planet. But the Burisma situation between Joe Biden and the Ukraine, that has been part of what festered and ultimately created this proxy war. A lot of it was to cover up the corruption between the Biden regime, where they were um, funneling money over there in this, to create this proxy war as a money laundering operation in the Ukraine. And this is what Canadian troops were being used for, training these guys to take part and facilitate in all of this. And so I was diving into Burisma in 2019, and this may shock a lot of people out there that might see this. Burisma is also a Canadian company, not just a Ukrainian company. So there's just another, part of the puzzle of the motives behind all of this, and none of this seems to be catching the eyes of anybody with teeth anywhere in the world. So that's where kind of grateful that we're getting a chance to finally talk about this, but where this is going now, the situation in Ukraine, Scott, it's gone completely sideways on them, hasn't it? Last my reports that I'm getting, and you can correct me if I'm out by any measure, up to possibly 750,000 casualties, 71-year-old men and 15-year-old boys and girls, and armor for pregnant women. This is what we're funding at the cost of $100 million a day over there. Is there an end in sight to this?
Well, the sad news is that so many Ukrainians have died. And, when we speak of Chrystia Freeland, when we speak of the Banderist movement, understand that it is a distinct minority of that the true believers, the true Banderists are a distinct minority in Ukraine today. But they are a violent minority that has been able to leverage their violence into fear and intimidation to the point where they dominate policy making, they dominate the policy structure. But the vast majority of the Ukrainian people are decent people. They're just like you and I. They want the same things we want. And the sad thing is, this conflict has destroyed their lives. Their fathers are dying. Their brothers are dying. Um, the numbers, we don't know exactly what they are, but they're horrific. The Poltava military commissar responsible for mobilization in the city and the region around the city of Poltava has said that of every 100 men that's mobilized, 80 to 90 of them are dead, crippled, wounded, otherwise disabled by war. 80 to 90% casualty rate. In most modern militaries, well-trained militaries, when a unit suffers 50 to 69% casualties, they're combat ineffective. They can't fight anymore. What he's saying is that these units are suffering 80 to 90% casualties. That means that the Ukrainian army is constantly in need of replenishing these units. A unit goes into battle, it's going to be decimated. They pull whatever's left back out, and it has to be reconstituted. Early on in the conflict, they were reconstituting these depleted units with troops that were sent out for rather extensive training in the West. They received some basic training in Ukraine. They went to the West to get more training. And that was the army that was reconstituted sometime in the spring, early summer of 2022. The 45 billion Lend-Lease Act that America put forward. This army performed well. They're the ones that carried out the counterattack that drove the Russians out of Kharkov, that recaptured the right bank of Kherson. But they suffered tremendous casualties. Again, there were 60 to 80,000 of these fresh troops. They suffered casualty rates of 80 to 90%. So they're gutted. So a new army was raised. This is the army that we currently see. It's the one that's being sacrificed today in this ongoing counteroffensive. NATO trained around 40,000 troops. Another 20 some odd thousand were trained inside Ukraine. An additional 40,000 were mobilized for this. So something short of 100,000 troops were trained for this offensive. According to Vladimir Putin, 71,000 of these troops are already casualties. That's 71%. of the mobilized troops are casualties, which means that um, the Ukrainian army is combat ineffective. They now need to raise a whole new army, but there's no one left to raise. They are compelled to do what Nazi Germany had to do in the closing months of the war. You remember the Volkssturm, the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth, the People's Militia, the old men, the infirm men, the crippled men, the young boys were being dragged out into this conflict. There was the movie Jojo Rabbit. I don't know if that was popular in Canada. It won an Academy Award in the United States. It was a cute little movie about a German boy who fantasized about talking to Adolf Hitler. But in the end, he and his compatriots are mobilized into the Hitler Youth, and they're asked to defend their hometown against the Soviets. And you see just how pathetic it is. These old men, these young boys, they can't fight. In the battle for Berlin, as the Soviets came in, the German commanders, the professional soldiers, were begging their Nazi leaders to keep the Volkssturm away because they didn't add anything to the battle. In fact, when they came in, they were so incompetent, they actually made things worse for the Germans, as if anything could be worse than the final days of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. It was worse because these people can't fight. They're being slaughtered. They're expected to hold a position. They can't. This is the quality of the Ukrainian army that's being raised today. Old men, young boys, people with disabilities that otherwise would be, that would ban them from serving. They're now Ukraine is literally scraping the bottom of the barrel. They're also compelled to go out and get men that just don't want to fight. A lot of these Ukrainian soldiers that are fighting are pretty damn brave, excuse my language. They're not cowards. As much as I believe that Russia's on the right side of history, I will never denigrate the courage of the average Ukrainian soldier. They're doing things, frankly speaking, any Canadian soldier, if you got an honest to God, professional soldier on your show, and you ask them to comment on the courage it takes to do what the Ukrainian soldiers are doing, the answer is it's unimaginable courage to go into near certain death and to try and accomplish the impossible, because they're going up against one of the best armies in the world. The Russian army is extraordinarily well trained, well equipped. They're operating with sound doctrine. It's taken everybody by surprise after being told so long that the Russians are going to run. Suddenly now, look what everybody's saying. They're pretty good. They've built really good defenses. Their troops know what they're doing. That didn't happen overnight, people. That's because the Russian army was always that good. Ukrainians were also good, but they've been slaughtered. Now you have guys that otherwise might want to fight for their country, but they now know that they're not going to get trained. They're going to be brought in. They used to get 3 weeks of basic training, then about 5 weeks of more detailed training. Not enough, but enough to make you at least feel like you know what you're doing on the battlefield. They're now being taken, they're being given days worth of training, limited ammunition, and they're thrown into the most difficult combat environment imaginable, where their life expectancy is measured in minutes, not days. And they know this. They've heard stories about this. So people just don't want to participate in this anymore, and they're trying to avoid being conscripted. So the Ukrainian solution is to send these, vans out and bop guys on the head, beat them up, throw them into a van, take them to a center where they hold them hostage. They starve them. They beat them for days until the guys sign the conscription papers. And then they say, once you sign, now you have to go to war. It got so bad, some guy just leaked the footage of his torture for 6 days. And it was so bad, and the outcry amongst the Ukrainian public was so high that the police actually had to come in and arrest the military personnel that were doing this, because it's literally a crime. How do you expect these people to be motivated to fight and die for their country? They're not, especially in a losing cause. It's one thing to be told, how do you get the gonads, excuse my language, to go across the beach at Normandy, or to go across the beach at Iwo Jima, or the Canadians were in Dieppe? How do you do that? Because you believe in your cause, and you believe that if I make this push together with my fellow countrymen, even if we die, we're going to win. We're going to prevail. We're going to save the day for our loved ones back home. And so you're willing to run into the machine gun nest. You're willing to do things that no rational person would do because you accept that if I die, I don't want to die, but if I die, it's in service of a greater good where we might prevail. No Ukrainian believes that right now. They're looking at the futility of this action, and they understand that if they die in the battle, it's in a losing cause, a cause that can't be won. And this is a growing recognition along the entire line of contract. The Ukrainian soldiers are losing heart. These are brave men. Another quick story. During the Battle of Bakhmut, which I think everybody is familiar with, the very bloody battle for the town of Bakhmut, tens of thousands died on each side. The Wagner forces, sort of elite stormtroops, had surrounded a group of around 20 Ukrainian soldiers in a building. And they basically said, "You're going to die." And the Ukrainians knew it. They were going to die. So the Russians are calling out, "Hey, surrender, brother. Come over. We'll take care of you. We'll feed you. We'll take care of your wounded. We're not going to kill you. We're not going to torture you." And you know what the Ukrainian soldiers said? Ukrainian soldiers said, "Russians don't surrender. Russians don't surrender because they're Russian. We can call them Ukrainian all we want, but at the end of the day, they're Russian." That's a line that comes from the Second World War. A Soviet soldier, when surrounded by the Germans, when he was asked to surrender, he said, "Russians don't surrender." He had a grenade and he blew himself up to kill some Germans. Russians don't, and they all died. The Wagner guys went in and killed them all. But the Wagner guys said, "We're fighting ourselves." And this is the reality of this conflict. Russians are fighting Russians. Slavs are fighting Slavs. It's the greatest tragedy one can possibly imagine. But the Slavs on the side of the Ukrainian side are losing faith in the cause they're being asked to die for. Meanwhile, the Slavs fighting on the Russian side have redoubled their belief in what they're doing. They are firmly behind their leadership. They're firmly behind their cause. They're fighting for their existential survival. And perhaps most importantly, they're fighting the fight that their grandfathers fought nearly 80 years ago against
Mhm.
Nazi ideology. They're fighting against the Banderas. They know the reality of this horrific ideology. They know who Stepan Bandera is, and they are deeply resentful of the fact that the West has breathed life into an ideology that should have been annihilated, eliminated back in the Second World War. 27 million sets of eyeballs stare down on the Russians today, holding them to account for what they're doing in regards to the problem in Ukraine. The Russians believe this. This isn't propaganda. They believe it in their heart and their soul. And there's a difference. The Russians are motivated to win this war. Ukraine's losing hope. They don't know what to believe in anymore.
The, we're at the reality check part of some of the stuff I wanted to talk about. For you and I didn't get a chance to talk beforehand, but I've been, I'm friends with John Mark Dugan and Mike Jones over there, and been pretty closely watching. I've known John since before the conflict, so we're pretty well tuned in this. So it's good to get these reality checks in there, and it's tragic. This is as tragic as the American Civil War. This is
Absolutely.
literally family fighting family, and it's being done over money, power, and influence, and crimes and cover-ups and those kinds of things. And I spent my entire life as a student of history, and I studied World War II, and the parallels are so tragic. Again, I never thought I'd see panzers burning on the steppes again in my lifetime, and here this is exactly where we are: wash, rinse, repeat. And the old adage goes, "Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it." This is exactly where I believe we're kind of at, and nobody seems to be an adult in the room is the problem, except for Mr. Putin, Mr. Sleepy Joe and Fancy Socks Trudeau, and the rest of these young global leaders are such a charade, and people are blindly trapped in this dichotomy and not knowing what to do. And the media is playing a massively tragic part in this. They didn't tell people that Russia went into full 24/7, 365 war footing manufacturing on all of their weapons and equipment last August. And people wonder why they're surprised by the amount of material resources, manpower, organization structure, everything. But Ukraine's winning is all they want to tell people over here. We've got Zelensky here in Canada right now as we speak, passing around the collection plate, and I think he's pretty much seeing backs turned wherever he goes right now. My prediction is that sometime in the next 90 days he's going to be having dinner with Gaddafi and Saddam somewhere. So I think that's kind of where the world is kind of expecting this has got to change and got to stop because too many lunatics have got too many codes to too many buttons, and we need to put the brakes on this. So I'm kind of putting out this international call to all of my allies. We need to stop Joe's war because at the end of the day, this is NATO playing the part of the oligarchs in America that have bought and paid for the Biden regime that is facilitating or manifesting this war initiated by NATO, not Russia. Russia is in self-defense, and you nailed it. These guys have not forgotten history, and to this day, families and lineages still remembering and honoring their they have a march for this over there every year where the immortals, they march for the immortals, the people that
Yeah,
were
the
lost.
Immortal Regiment. Yeah,
Right. So they don't forget. So, and people don't understand the difference. And we can maybe talk about this, because talk to more boots on the ground guys, but the propaganda out of Russia is not hate America, death to America. It's death to the Satan worshipers and the pedophiles, and, to the, that kind of, so there's not this animosity and hate that our media over here portrays. That's fueling this fire and conflict. These guys are they're in it to save everything that their history, everything that is about them, and I don't think that this can continue. So this is why I want such public exposure on. It's up to us to ultimately stop the war. I think at the end of the day, politicians didn't stop the Vietnam War, public opinion did, and this is kind of where we need to get our butts in gear. Canada's had a pretty crazy week this week. Trudeau's having an absolutely horrid, wretched month, and I think that so is the military industrial complex in all of this. What do you see happening in the next couple of weeks? Because Mother General Nature is going to be kicking into gear over some really soon here. The fighting season's almost up over there, isn't it, John? Or Scott, sorry.
well, I mean, from a conventional standpoint, the fighting season is on. The in Russia, they when the rains start to fall, they have something they call the Rasputitsa, the muddy season, and it General Mud helped defeat Napoleon. It helped defeat Hitler, and there's many people that say that General Mud is going to have an impact on this war. The thing is that the Russians are General Mud, meaning that they know mud. So do the Ukrainians. I mean, mud is mud. Mud will do what mud does. It makes movement virtually impossible, but it doesn't stop you from fighting. Um, so I think that this notion that somehow the weather is going to automatically bring about a pause to the fighting, I think is misplaced. I think that the fighting will continue. Um, Russia has no interest in bringing a pause to this fighting. It's prevailing. It's the things are going the way Russia wants. So I imagine that Russia will continue to put the pressure on until which time the Ukrainian army breaks. And I think the Ukrainian army is closer to the breaking point than they have ever been in this conflict. As we said, they have been burning through their trained manpower. They've been burning through their equipment. All they have to replace it are the Volkssturm equivalents. And the next wave of tanks. Yeah, they might get 31 M1A1 tanks from the United States, but it won't have the depleted uranium infused armor that makes it survivable. It's going to be the old armor that's cut through like a hot knife through butter with all the weapons that the Russians have. So it's a death trap for the Ukrainians. There's only 31 of them. They're not going to change the tide of battle. More armor is being provided by the Panzers are being provided by Germany through the Denmark, Netherlands, etc. But like in Denmark, they had to go and pull tanks out of a museum to train the people while they were trying to refurbish these tanks. They've sent them over and at least 10 of the tanks that they sent over to Ukraine have been rejected by the Ukrainians who say, these are garbage. They don't work. We can't use them. This is where we're at right now. Poorly trained, poorly fit uh, soldiers married up with equipment that has no real. How would you like to be a Ukrainian driving a 70-ton M1 Abrams in the mud? It'll just sink, and then you're dead. Lancet loitering munitions are going to come in and kill you. So I don't think I think Ukraine is hoping, and you see this with General Mark Miley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States. He's basically saying, yeah, we got about 30 more days of fighting left, and then things are going to come to a halt. No, General. The fighting's never going to end until Russia destroys the army that the United States, Canada, NATO, and everybody else has been building up in Ukraine. The sad thing is when Lindsey Graham, a U.S. Senator, Republican from South Carolina, says that this war will go on until the last Ukrainian, he means it. The war will go on to the last Ukrainian. At some point in time, I hope your prediction comes true, and I actually support it. I think Zelensky is on his last legs. You know, he's an actor whose usefulness has outrun the script, and because the story has changed, and you know he's not going to raise the money that he wants. He's getting a lot of pushback. Relationships are disintegrating with Poland, of all nations. There's tension with Germany. There's tension with France. There's tension here in the United States. Congress is not going to invite him in. He's not going to get to address the joint. You remember last year he had, the standing ovation, Nancy Pelosi, Ukrainian flag signed by Nazis, Slava Ukraina in the People's House, meeting with the president, handing him a medal that was given to him by a Nazi, inviting 4 Azov regiment officials into the People's House where they gave speeches, raised money, sold Nazi paraphernalia. Those days are over. That was sort of the high watermark of Ukraine and this hate-filled ideology that seized control of Ukraine's heart and soul. Zelensky has lost his effectiveness as a leader. The military has lost faith with him. The oligarchs have lost faith. But most importantly, the thing that kept him alive was his allies, the ability to go out and squeeze for money. Because, Ukraine is the most corrupt nation on the planet. And so how does Zelensky continue to be there? Because he provides billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, 60% of which gets taken by corruption. And so $100 billion gets divvied up a long way. You can buy a lot of loyalty there as long as you're paying them off. But if he comes back and he's not bringing the money, he's not living up to his end of the agreement. And that's when people are going to say, we no longer have a use for you, because the military says you suck as a military commander. We think you suck as a human being. We're not willing to continue to fund your lifestyle. So either you're going into exile or you're going to die. And he'll be given the choice. That's why he's stolen, according to Seymour Hersh, upwards of $400 million himself, which he's fitted away in various investments in banks around the world, including a big house in Miami, one in Paris. So I think Zelensky's gone. Now the question is who's going to replace him, because that's key. If he's replaced by somebody who is, hard right-wing Azov battalion leaning kind of person, this conflict could go on for a while. But if he's replaced with somebody who is responsible, who is realistic, this war could end tomorrow. Ukraine has lost this war, and it's time for people to recognize that Ukraine has lost this war. This fantasy that somehow Ukraine is going to recapture the lost lands, take back Crimea, defeat the Russian army, compel Putin to turn himself into The Hague, you'd have to be snorting a lot of white powder to believe that kind of nonsense. The future leader is going to have to look at things such as, can we end this war and still have access to the Black Sea? Can we end this war and still retain the industrial, foundations that exist in Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk, and et cetera? Because the answer right now is yes, you probably can, which means there's a future for Ukraine. But if they continue this conflict much longer, Russia is not only going to destroy the Ukrainian military, but Russia will make advances into the Ukrainian heartland and capture Kharkov, capture Kramatorsk, capture Nikolaev, capture Odessa, seal off the Black Sea from what's left of Ukraine. And that's the end of Ukraine as a modern nation state. That's what's at stake here in terms of geopolitics. But also, what's at stake here is the lives of the average Ukrainian citizen. As I said, um, Ukraine's manhood is being eviscerated. I mean, and the genetic, you know, the pool for Ukraine is being watered down because they're losing so many men. Um, families will not, children will be raised without fathers, hundreds of thousands
100%.
of children. If you think about, and I think it's as important in Canada as here in the United States, when you talk about the importance of education for a child to develop properly, to be well educated so they can conform to society, become good members of society, what's the number one thing they talk about is stability. Stability in the
Mhm.
home, stability in the community, stability at school. Well, you can't have stability when you've been ripped out of your town, your village, your city, and then been thrown across the country in a refugee camp that you're now going to be condemned to be raised in for the next 4, 5, 6 years. Those are the developing years. That's when you need the stability. And now they have nothing. They have the opposite of it, chaos, anarchy. We're condemning an entire generation of Ukrainian youth to a life of great difficulty. And problems are inherited, meaning that their children are going to suffer from the problems that they have today. We're destroying the Ukrainian people, destroying the Ukrainian nation. And someday Chrystia Freeland and her ilk need to be held to account for this. People who claim to be Ukrainian patriots, claim to be doing things in support of greater Ukraine, they're murdering Ukrainians. They're destroying the nation they claim to love. They need to be held to account because all this blood that's being spilled is on their hands.
I pray for a lot of those things, Scott. There will be accountability someday. I think I'm getting more and more encouraged by the day as I see the world's response to Zelensky. We're seeing European nations that are saying no, they've had enough of it. His request to turn in all refugees as criminals back to Ukraine so they could be thrown to the meat grinders, being denied. The person that put him ultimately in power, his right hand guy there, the dog fighting within the own house. This is on its last leg. This thing, and I have so much empathy for the Ukrainians because you're right. This is the most needless war in modern history. Absolutely. And it's going to have the biggest impact. So much of the farmlands have been destroyed, these depleted uraniums, these bombs, so much of this country is now a wasteland. And the thing that's bad for us, good to the end of the war, is all of the people that Zelensky has to grease the hands of to keep this going, that he's been the money provider for. They've been getting paid in US dollars, and the writing is on the wall right now for the US dollar, and people are not. They're not choosing the side of America in the grand scheme of economic things moving forward. Talking about BRICS in relation to that, people I don't think are willing to do the things that Zelensky is required for US dollars, and he doesn't have the access to that side of the future. So I think that as the American dollar becomes less valuable because of the international trade situation, monetary situation, I mean, realistically, Putin bought more goodwill. He bought the goodwill of an entire continent in like 3 months. That took America how many trillions and billions of dollars in lives to get the goodwill of Africa, and Putin has flipped that on its lid. So this international shift is not going in the way of these people that are being requested to give more to this charade that I call the conflict in the Ukraine. Am I far off on that? Maybe playing a factor in this hastening of the end of the war. How do we get people to be focusing on, or what do we need to be focusing on as a public to speed up this process?
Well, I
before we
think we're
all.
looking at, this conflict is sort of the end game of the American hegemonists. It is the manifestation of their last desperate effort to remain viable. It's a war that America started. It's a war that's designed to thwart, um, Russia's, um, rise out of the ashes of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin doesn't get the credit he deserves for saving Russia and then restoring Russia. Um, but that's the case. We don't want Russia restored, so we're trying to do our best to tear that down. The same thing with China. We don't want China to emerge as a viable competitor to us. So we have to tear it down. So you're seeing a lot of actions in that regard, but it's a rear guard action, meaning that we're going to lose. The day of the American hegemon, the day of the American singularity is over. It's already past us. Um, I think history might show, you're a historian, maybe you'll agree with me or disagree with me on this, but that what happened in South Africa last month is one of the turning points of the demise of American singularity. And that is, of course, the BRICS summit, where they finally matured into a viable multilateral organization with a plan, with a mission. They've expanded. They've surpassed the G7 in terms of economic clout. They're surpassing the G20 in terms of the viability of an organization. And this is the end of American exceptionalism. This is the rise of multilateralism, and that's what we're seeing here. We're this conflict in Ukraine has hastened this transition. The United States apparently blew up the Nord Stream pipeline in an effort to deny Germany and Europe access to cheap Russian energy, because we recognize that unless we were able to divorce Europe from Russian gas, Europe would never go along with the insanity that we insist takes place in order to preserve the status quo ante, American exceptionalism. So the other thing that's going on, and this is where I get a little, I have to admit that this part of my analysis, if you ask me about arms control, you ask me about missiles, you ask me about military things, I'm pretty confident in what I say. Now I'm getting into economics. I'm not an economist. I don't have a Harvard MBA, but there's people out there like Michael Hudson. You might be familiar with him, who are fairly competent, but they say some interesting things about how do you counter the inevitable decline of the petrodollar, the de-dollarization that's taking place as we speak. And BRICS is a big part of de-dollarization. And one of the theories that's out there is that the United States can't afford to let the dollar collapse, because that would have a precipitous negative impact on the American economy and the economy of Canada as well. So what America needs to do is preserve dollar domains where the dollar will remain the dominant currency, so that we at least are able to keep circulating the dollars the way that we do, to the benefit of the American economy. And one dollar domain is Europe. But to get to Europe, we have to destroy the euro, which is sort of what we're doing right now by blowing up Nord Stream 2. We created an energy need that only we can fulfill, but at 5 times the price they are paying. The deindustrialization of Germany, of France, of Europe is taking place. The collapse of the European economic viability model, and we're doing the same. I believe we're trying to do the same in South America, to again attack their currencies, cause economic collapse, get nations like Argentina to buy into the international monetary organizations hijacking of their economy, so that we have places where the dollar reigns supreme. And that will allow us to offset the growing influence of the Chinese renmin, of the Indian rupee, of the Russian ruble. And I think that's the direction that we're heading. But Ukraine has hastened this, because this de-dollarization was supposed to take decades. supposed to be managed properly and paced. But instead, because we tried to destroy Russia through economic sanctions, we hastened the collapse of Europe. And so we're trying to play catch up right now. There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of anarchy, and there's no guarantee that it's going to end the way the United States envisions it to end. What we can say is that the multipolarity that's being built by Russia, China, India, the BRICS nations, etc., um, seems to be the wave of the future. And nations like the United States, Canada, the nations of Europe are going to be on the outside looking in as nations that we once mocked as the global South, as the developing nations are going to be looking at us saying, huh, "You're a bunch of has-beens. We are the have it now."
There's a reason why precious metals, gold and silver, have been, established currencies for 5,000 years, and these, I'll give you monopoly money in exchange of, has been tried and tried and tried and tried and failed. To it will only bear the weight of the corruption imposed upon it. So that's almost done, and you've kind of hit the nail on the head there with with South Africa and these guys, we forced this to happen by trying to say that we would crush Russia's economy, and it backfired. And Russia's economy has only gotten stronger.
Stronger.
Basically, they're a thriving nation. They're more like 1980 America than than 2000 America right now, literally. And there's needs to be this distinction because what Putin brought back to life and resurrected in Russia is not the USSR. There is a very different mindset. It's not the same nation. It is a nation that looked up to us for decades because of what we had. Now they started to get it, and now we kind of turned on them. And looking through history, Russia's kind of saved America's butt more than once, and they don't forget as easily as we tend to over here. But this is kind of really playing out, I think, in where these other nations are looking, because they're not making knee-jerk reactions on things. They're literally thinking about their nation's future and their people. And personally, my opinion was about Nord Stream, and I'd like to throw this in there, is initially Germany said no to sending more tanks to Zelensky, so they got taught a lesson when they got their pipeline taken away, because almost 3 days later, I think it was, they said, okay, you spanked us. We'll send tank to Ukraine again. We'll get part of this, but none of this is going to change anything. F-16s isn't going to change anything. The only thing that's happening day by day by day is we are destroying more of Ukraine, more needless loss of life, and this could be over in a day. And this is what ultimately, this world geoeconomic situation. I'm no expert either, but in watching history, watch, rinse, repeat, we need to get on triage on our own side of it. And my thinking of that is the way to strengthen and fortify our currency is get back to manufacturing. We don't manufacture a damn thing over here anymore, and stop selling our gold mines and resources to China. These are just simply, things, and this is what we're trying to encourage Canadians up here, at least, to maybe start to get back to doing some of those kinds of things. Scott, what do in the last 5 minutes here, I really want to respect your time. I don't want to bogart it. Maybe you'll come back and join us again if you had fun. Uh, the next last 5 minutes, what's some of the things that we need, or we can expect to see coming, or we should be watching for, or expect from what's coming up in the next little bit? I see, a lot of stuff going on in the Black Sea. I see reports of Russia kind of moving on the offensive. What's is it that's got your interest for the next week or so?
Well, I mean, the big story is going to be the collapse of Zelensky. I think we're seeing the political collapse of Zelensky and the loss of viability. And these things can drag out over time, or they can just snowball. You never know with domestic politics. What kind of crisis undercurrent exists in Ukraine. So it's going to be interesting. I think What Poland is doing right now, vis-a-vis Ukraine, is a game-changing thing, not only for Ukraine but also for NATO, because what Poland is saying is that um, this war has created massive instability, and Poland can't trust anybody. They don't trust NATO anymore. They don't. They feel betrayed by the Ukrainian conflict, and so they're looking to themselves. Now, this might be a political ploy because we have an election coming up in Poland, but it's fascinating. It's a different dynamic. If we were talking about Poland last month, everybody would have been talking about the possibility of Poland working with Lithuania and a coalition of the willing to seek to annex Western Ukraine into Poland, creating a greater Poland. I think that discussion's over. I think Poland has given up on Ukraine. Poland's looking to preserve Poland. Um, so that's going to be there, and that bleeds over into Zelensky's demise, because if you lose Poland, um, that Zelensky was looking to Poland as his sort of a Alamo. I don't know if Canadians understand the role of
Oh yeah.
Alamo in history. Okay, so this was his Alamo. He was going to fall back. This was going to be his fortress. This relationship he was developing with Poland, where they would have customs union, open borders, etc. That's done, finished. Poland and Ukraine are it's an ugly divorce that's happening as we speak, and as that go, I think you're going to see Europe starting to shed its loyalty. So I think again, if you had asked me a month ago where my focus would be, I would have said military. I'd be looking at the military collapse. I'd be focusing on how Russia is turning the tide on the battlefield from defeating the Ukrainian attack and now transitioning into a counterattack that pushes the Ukrainians back. But remember, war is an extension of politics by other means. And if you don't need to sacrifice troops on the battlefield, the wise leader, if he can accomplish it by letting the other people collapse on their own volition, you don't necessarily have to push your troops forward. So I'm thinking more and more that the Russians are looking at what's happening here and are making a calculation that says we will retain constant pressure on the Ukrainians because we don't want to give them pause, give a chance to rebuild, requip, etc. We're going to put constant pressure, hoping that the Ukrainians collapse. But meanwhile, we're going to just go hands off and let Ukraine collapse on its own volition. And that's what we're seeing. I think the big story in the next few weeks and months is going to be the political collapse of Ukraine. I always believed that military collapse would come first. But now what I'm looking at is I believe that political collapse may occur first. That collapse, we don't know how it's going to play out. If Zelensky goes, one of the dangers of wishing Zelensky to go, if you're the West, is who's going to replace him. And right now, I don't think the West can control that outcome. If you get rid of Zelensky, you're disrupting a whole bunch of domestic political dynamics in Ukraine. I personally believe his likely successor is going to be somebody from the military, not from the Azov. I don't think the Azov people are as powerful as they think they are. They've suffered a lot of casualties. They're very much at the mercy of the military. I think what we're seeing is a group of military leaders who are emerging in Ukraine, much like, if you remember, at the end of World War I, you're a historian, the German military leaders who emerged from the defeat on the Western Front, but they didn't believe they were defeated. They believed they were stabbed in the back. And I think you're going to see a bunch of emerging Ukrainian military leaders who are going to be promoting a new stab in the back theory, stabbed in the back by Zelensky, stabbed in the back by the West. And these military leaders may be inclined to actually normalize relations with Russia, to seek a equitable outcome. And they will believe that that's what they're sacrificing for right now, is to hold on to as much of Ukraine as possible until they can end this conflict. They know they've lost the 4 territories. They know they're not getting Crimea back. What they're hoping right now is to prevent Russia from taking Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Odessa, to bring this war to an end. And I think we're going to be seeing that kind of transition. Zelensky out? Is he going to die a violent death? Maybe. Or is he going to be shown the door out and allowed to fall in on his $400 million that he's stolen from the Ukrainian people? That's a possibility too. But I do think that the big story in the coming weeks and months is going to be the political demise of Zelensky and the internal struggle in Ukraine on who and what replaces him.
I last question, and I'll get out of here. This is going to be kind of a winging it Hail Mary out there in an ironic twist of fate. You speak to being at the mercy of the military since the end of Prigozhin. The Wagner unit ends up finding themselves like 50 kilometers away from Kiev with nothing to do and at the mercy of the military. Are they going to be a name of note in the final days of this conflict? Perhaps I puts a question to my other friend over who's actually living over there, and he wouldn't. The fact that he wouldn't refuse to, or that he refused to say anything, told me that there was reason for him not saying anything. I don't think their saga is over yet.
No, not at all. First of all, remember when Prigozhin betrayed Putin, and that's what happened. He betrayed Putin. Um, he was over. His time was done. Um, Putin gave Wagner a chance on 29 June in a meeting with Prigozhin present to be absorbed by the Ministry of Defense as an intact unit, retain all of its command structure without Prigozhin. Prigozhin was done. You don't betray Putin and get to command Wagner. But Wagner has a great skill set. They have a unique command structure, operational methodology that has proven itself in combat, an ethos, and more importantly, they've won the hearts of many Russian people. They're very popular in Russia. Um, I believe that as we speak, Wagner is being reconstituted as a military arm underneath uh, the Russian National Guard, which is sort of the Ministry of Interior Troops. That's the future of Wagner, and that they are going to be brought back into the Ukrainian theater of operations, and they will play an important role in the end game of this conflict. I don't believe we've seen the last of Wagner, because they it's also important politically for Putin. Um, he's not afraid of Wagner. He could have crushed him anytime he wants, but Putin's also not somebody who creates needless and unnecessary internal conflicts. And I think that he's going to nip the potential political problem of Wagner in the bud by allowing Wagner to join in on the end game of this conflict, to share in the glory of the defeat of Ukraine. So I think Wagner will play a big role, not the biggest role, but a big role in the final act.
I 100% correct on that, and I look forward to it. Thank you for taking the time to humor us tonight, Scott. It's been a real treat, a real pleasure. I've got your Twitter account up here. Where else can, or what should people know to follow you, to support your work, to stay up to date on what's going on?
Well, I think the easy, and it's right there in the Twitter account. ScottRitterExtra.com is the website. If you go there, it's a one-stop shop for everything that I do. For instance, if you send me a link to this show, I'll post a link, and that I have a Substack there. The subscription is free. If people want to do a paid subscription, I appreciate it. None of this happens for free. But I don't charge anybody anything. All my articles can be accessed. Any podcasts I do are there. But that's where you go. If I've written it, if I've spoken it, it's going to be on ScottRitterExtra.com.
Can they buy your new book there too?
You can. You can buy the book, The Disarming the Time of Perestroika. We also are we're doing fundraising for a documentary film that I'm making. That's the goal of which is to try and uh, tear apart or take down Russophobia, the fear of Russia, the ignorance of Russia. I spent 26 days this past May in Russia doing a
Mhm.
book tour through 12 cities, and I gained a lot of insights. And so the movie Waging Peace is going to be um, is going to explain Russia to the audience using this trip and using my past experience in Russia as the vehicle to do that. And but documentaries, they just don't happen. They cost money, and so we're trying to raise some money in support of the film. And you can donate there. There's a it's wagingpeace.fund, but you can find it on scottredirector.com. And anybody who would like to help in the making of this movie, any contribution would be deeply appreciated.
Well, I'm sure we'll be able to get more in the future on that. Maybe there's more that we can do. This is a big priority for me, ending that Russophobia thing. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I've got friends that are walking the talk over there. They're doing everything that they can, it, net short of going over there myself, I want to do everything I can to help people understand that this is needless, it's nonsense, and it's time to hashtag stop Joe's war. Anything that we can do to help, we're on board. So thanks so much for that, Scott. If you want to hang out in the back end there for just a second, I'll give you some of the details on where you can share this stuff out. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us Canucks.
Thanks for having me. The Great
You
White North.
probably don't get that many requests from Canada.
No, no, I think I can count the number of Canadian requests on one hand, and it's three. So
Well, I'm pretty sure now that we've cracked the ice on that, you'll get a few more cheers, so
okay,
I do hope you come back to join us again sometime. So thanks, Scott. All right, guys, that was wow, that was a drink from the fire hose. I've been waiting a long time for that. I know that there's going to be questions that I will have forgotten. If you guys want to send me some questions that you have after seeing this, maybe we can get enough together to get Scott to come back and join us again sometime real soon. So, on that note, guys, you guys know what's to do. Give it a like, a share, a subscribe. Don't forget to sign up to the get notifications on whatsupcanada.org, lgm.news, and check out our sponsors over there, patriotswitch.com, where we are literally taking on Procter Gamble, Johnson and Johnson, Unilever, and hitting the cabal where it hurts permanently. And you heard a little bit about the financial situation. There's a place there with a new company that has stepped up to help service all of your gold and silver needs at precious or New World Precious Metals. So, on that note, I love you all. Stay strong, and we will see you soon.